This week's readings examine the nature of conservative and collective violence in 19th century Ontario and New Brunswick. In both studies, the violence was directed at groups who did not fit, in some sense, with the majority population and their dominant ideology. In Ontario, it was the more democratic and reform-minded groups who opposed the Anglican-dominated system. In New Brunswick, it was the large number of Irish Catholics who immigrated there following the tragic potato famine in Ireland during the 1840s. In both cases, the violence was perpetrated by groups who sought to keep the status quo. In both cases, these conservative groups were often supported by agents of the state and not properly prosecuted, since the state agents, for example, police, magistrates, even mayors, were most often allied with and supportive of the existing system. Scott C.'s article examines the nativist reaction in New Brunswick to large numbers of poor Irish Catholics immigrating to that colony during a time of economic depression, so that there was a traditional animosity among Irish Protestants towards Irish Catholics, coupled with an economic depression, which thereby triggered anxiety and fear of these new immigrants and led to waves of collective violence. What if those entrusted with maintaining law and order themselves commit crimes? What prompts persons within the legal system or the government, more broadly understood, to use violence and commit crimes in a so-called law-abiding society? The article by Carol Wilton examines violence in Upper Canada, that is, Ontario, in the first half of the 19th century. It looks at a particular type of violence, or rather, violent and criminal acts committed by particular groups or persons. She begins by discussing the Types Riot of 1825, in which the printing press of the important reformer William Lyon Mackenzie, a Scottish rabble-rouser, was attacked. Mackenzie was an important reform advocate in Upper Canadian politics, who railed against the undemocratic nature of the Upper Canadian political and social systems. Mackenzie himself was elected to the Upper Canadian Legislative Assembly, but was constantly challenged by the governing elites and was periodically expelled from the assembly during the 1830s. The case of the Types Riot is an example of what Wilton calls conservative political violence, or violence such as assault, property damage, or other public order offenses directed at those who oppose the existing political order. In the context of the article, that is, in the first half of the 19th century, the existing political order was that of the family compact, a small group of elite persons and families who dominated the social, economic, and political life of Upper Canada. These were men who had the leisure, education, skills, manners, and connections to dominate life in Upper Canada. The term hegemony is often used to describe the manner in which one group or even nation dominates others. In the first half of the 19th century, the family compacts, groups' religious affiliation, the Church of England, or otherwise known as Anglicanism, and their political ideology, that is, devotion to property rights and the monarchy, suspicion and opposition to American republicanism and democracy, were deemed to be the established or dominant or hegemonic views, and so, therefore, the views of others who opposed them were not often accepted. The violence often perpetrated by persons who were part of or who defended this elite has been called lawless law. These were acts which took place often within the legal system or by persons supposed to uphold it. In a modern context, perhaps think of police brutality. In the context of Upper Canadian society, the lawless law was a response to the challenges of their hegemony. To take one example from the article, there was the case of the violence against pro-Durham supporters in Richmond Hill in October 1839. The pro-Durhamites were supporters of Lord Durham, the British politician given the task to investigate the causes of the 1837 and 1838 rebellions in Upper and Lower Canada. Durham, in his famous report, concluded that in Upper Canada there was a monopoly on power by an oppressive, privileged group which looked after its own interests. Thus, the pro-Durhamites were supporting Lord Durham's identification of the problems of the Upper Canadian political system and his recommendation of granting responsible government to the two colonies, Upper and Lower Canada. Responsible government meant reform of the Upper Canadian government so that more power and authority would be placed in the hands of people who were elected rather than in the hands of people who were appointed. The anti-Durhamite violence at Richmond Hill was illustrative of the conservative political violence, as this violent group was led by none other than the local sheriff, William Botsford Jarvis, and included the mayor, several aldermen, and even magistrates. What better example could there be to show how this lawless law included the very persons who were supposed to uphold law and order in the state, but who instead used violence to intimidate those who held opposing views, and therefore views that threatened the dominant or hegemonic group's view in place in the world. It is clear too that the rise of conservative violence itself was linked to its own losing cause. That is, conservative political violence increased as calls for reform in the colony also increased. The two were linked, and showed how the dominant group lashed out against the challenge to their privileged place. As Wilton concludes, the lawless law of Upper Canadian conservatives in the 1820s and 1830s was an indication of the weakening of conservative hegemony in the province, notwithstanding the apparent strengths of the regime. Political violence ultimately eroded legitimacy for the government and led to the granting of responsible government to the Upper Canadian colony. Scott C.'s article on social violence in New Brunswick focuses on the violence perpetrated by an exclusively Protestant fraternal group, the Orange Order, against unwanted newcomers to the region, large numbers of Irish Catholics. One thing that most people know about Ireland, besides the tragic potato famine of the 1840s, which killed nearly 13% of the country's population, is that there has been a history of sectarian animosity between the Irish Protestants and Catholics. The Orange Order was an important institution which promoted animosity against Catholics.
The Orange Order was one of Ireland's most important exports. With the British Army and with Irish migrants, it was established throughout the British Empire, in Britain, Australia, New Zealand, America, and even parts of Africa. Outside of Ireland, the Orange Order in Canada, however, was the largest and most important. This makes sense for a number of reasons. For one, we have repeatedly read that there were more Irish Protestants than Catholics in Canada, though one should always remember that one cannot assume that any Irish Protestant in Canada or in elsewhere or anywhere else was actually a member of the Orange Order. Many were, but most were not. For another, Canada's political and social culture have traditionally been loyal and conservative. I mean small c conservative. By this I mean that in the 19th century, for example, movements for American-style republicanism or even radical reform were not generally popular. After the American War of Independence, of course, American loyalists fled in large numbers north to Canada, loyal to the Crown and desirous of remaining within the British Empire. Also, the Order provided an important support network to members, at a time when there was very little in terms of a state-provided social safety net. This is the century before old age pension, welfare, and so on. Let's recall what the Orange Order was. It was a Protestant fraternal organization dedicated to the Protestant Constitution and the memory of William III. In Britain and Ireland in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Anglican Church specifically held a legally privileged position and was actually the state church. The order itself was established in County Armagh in the north of Ireland in 1795 by Protestant veterans of sectarian clashes with Catholic groups earlier that year. In the north of Ireland, where there were populations or communities of Protestants and Catholics living in close proximity, there was a history of sectarian violence where armed gangs would defend their own community and attack the rival one. The Orange Order arose out of one such sectarian clash in 1795. The Orange Order had much in common with Freemasonry, as it was organized by local lodges and had many of the ritualistic stylings of the Freemasons. The order was also inherently anti-Catholic. The issues between Irish Catholics and Protestants were not theological in nature, but had more to do with winners and losers. Scott C.'s article explores what the Orange Order is more infamous for: marching and fighting. C. does a good job of contextualizing the social and economic landscape of St. John, New Brunswick during the 1840s, when sectarian clashes between Irish Catholics and Protestants was rife. During the economically depressed 1840s, the influx of Catholic immigrants was not accepted by the Protestant population, as these famine migrants were destitute and undercut the labor market by driving down wages. It is also true that, particularly in the 19th century, Irish Catholics were seen by many English, as well as some Irish Protestants, as another race of people, and Catholic Irish and Victorian political cartoons are often drawn in a simian or ape-like way. In addition to this, there was the real fear among Protestants that Irish Catholics could not be trusted to think for themselves. The worry here was that Catholics would do whatever their parish priest told them to do, or would do whatever the Pope in Rome told them to do. This fear is not so surprising when one remembers that as late as the 1950s and early 1960s, there was a similar concern in American politics. Irish Catholic American John F. Kennedy, it was feared, were he to be elected president, would give undue weight to the advice of Catholic leadership and the Pope. The violence in St. John, often arising out of the confrontation of Catholic and Protestant groups at marches, was of course not unique to St. John. That said, the context provided by C helps explain the particular local conditions and reasons why violence there occurred in the late 1840s.